Historians and investigators have the unenviable task of trying to solve some of the strangest mysteries that ever occurred. It's understandable then that hundreds of these cases remain cold, either due to a lack of evidence or because they happened so long ago that most of the people involved are no longer alive or can no longer be located. Number 10. Most archaeological mysteries are unearthed in remote areas, deserts, or in ancient ruins that stood untouched for centuries. But in some cases, these artifacts are in plain sight, and many people have no idea what they are or how they got there. This is the case with a landmark of London that has fascinated people for centuries. It's called the London Stone and can be found on Cannon Street, where it's been incorporated into building number 111. While it's known that this nondescript rock stood in the same spot for a very long time, historians and experts have never been able to figure out who brought it there or what its purpose was. It measures 21 by 17 by 12, and according to a study that was conducted in the 1960s, it's composed of Clipsum limestone. It's been suggested it was once part of a strip of Jurassic rock that can be found between Lincolnshire and Dorset, but others feel that it may have been brought to London from Cotswolds. It's certain that the rock was in London from as early as 1578, since it's been depicted on maps from that time. But a description from that year also states that it was much bigger, and hence we now know that the piece of rock that remains in London is only a fragment of the original. It was present during the Great Fire of London in 1666, and despite all the buildings around it being razed to the ground, it remained intact. When those buildings were then cleared, a remarkable discovery was made. Up to that point, everyone believed that the rock was just as it appeared. But when architects started rebuilding the properties that had been destroyed, they started digging around the rock and realized there was more to it than meets the eye. The visible portion of the stone was actually the smallest part, as the rest extended about 10 feet into the ground like a root. Following this, more theories were put forward, with some historians suggesting that it served as a marker from where all the roads in historic London were measured, as they all may have been built from that spot outward. Back then, the rock stood in the middle of the street, but as London became more congested, the decision was made to move it next to the wall of St. Swithin's Church. It then survived the entire Second World War intact, after which it was treated like the landmark that it was. The church was destroyed during the war, and it was replaced with an office block in 1962. The stone was incorporated into the building with a small window through which it could be viewed. This is where it remains today, but we're no closer to figuring out why the stone was brought here and what its true purpose was. As is expected, many theories have been put forward though, such as that it stood in that spot since prehistoric times. Number 9. Thanks to several ancient inscriptions that have been found throughout history, we know with certainty that a city called Agade once stood, but for centuries, historians have tried and failed to figure out where it stood. It's said that the city, which is also known as Akkad, was the very beating heart of the first great empire that was ever established. It existed around 4,100 years ago and united all of Mesopotamia under a solitary king. At one point, it was nearly destroyed, but when it was rebuilt, it was named the capital of its region by Sargon the Great, the very first ruler of the Akkadian Empire. He lived between 2334 and 2279 BC, and created his empire by defeating the forces of Sumerian cities in that area. It should be noted that Sargon didn't found this city, but rebuilt it after sacking it and realizing it had a massive potential as a capital. Once he defeated his enemies, Sargon created a centralized government, and the city served as a symbol of his revolutionary ideas that strayed from Sumerian traditions. Ishtar the Warlike was named as the city's goddess, along with the god Ilaba. But not everyone was as impressed by the city as its inhabitants, as on many occasions it was besieged, but with very little success. But when Sharkali Shari, the son of Naram-Sin, passed away, the city started to see some troubles, not only thanks to infighting, but also thanks to invaders from the Gushans who lived in the Zagros Mountains. During these conflicts, the Akkadian dynasty was brought to an end, but but the city stood firm for many more centuries. Sometime around 1800 BC, the rulers of the city of Eshnunna traveled there during military campaigns, and it's believed that the city was still filled with citizens, traders, and visitors. It's even mentioned in the very first book of the Bible, Genesis. It's listed as one of the cities ruled by Nimrod, the great-grandson of Noah, along with Babel, Calneh, and Erech. We know that Akkad was still standing in the 7th century BC, as an Assyrian official named Mar Assar was tasked by the emperor to assume control of the city. That's when historical references of Akkad started to become less common. The last known mention of the city, still standing, is contained in an inscription made by Cyrus the Great of Persia, the conqueror of Babylon. The inscription dates from 559 BC, and it includes Akkad in a list of cities that make up his vast empire. Despite all these clues, we have no idea where the city stood all those centuries ago. Ancient texts hint that it was built close to Babylon and the Tigris and Diyala rivers, but many searches have been carried out in these areas by archaeologists over the years, but none have found any trace of Akkad. Number 8. In 1930, Maurice Graham had made a name for himself as a World War I veteran, and by his time, a highly regarded airmail pilot. He was hailed by the Professional Pilots Association as a world champion male pilot after he completed more than 175,000 miles of flight on his usual route that stretched between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City. He had never arrived late, never experienced any mid-flight emergencies, and was never forced to make a forced landing. During the war, he served in France as part of the 50th Aero Squadron. He completed a series of very dangerous missions and ended up being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and became known for his uncanny ability to avoid being hit by enemy fire. He would later state that whenever he felt he needed to turn right to avoid being hit, he would turn left and vice versa. He was discharged from service in October of 1919, after which he returned to his hometown of California. He married his fiancée Alice a few days later. When airmail was privatized in 1926, Maurice was one of the first pilots to sign up for the position. He and his fellow pilots, who were tasked with flying the same route, first surveyed the route by car, placing massive canvases in the shape of the letter T along the way, so that they would never get lost, even at night, and so that they would know where to land in case of an emergency. He made his first airmail flight on the 17th of April that year, with a cargo that contained a meal of eggs and ham that was kept warm by the plane's engine. It was a gift from the Breakfast Club of Los Angeles, which sent the meal as a gift to the mayor of Salt Lake City. For the next few years, Maurice completed thousands of hours in his biplane without incident, but that changed on the 10th of January, 1930. Before he took off, another pilot warned him of bad weather along the route, but Maurice would not be dissuaded from completing his delivery. It's believed that after he took off, he circled the area for about an hour, looking for a break in the thick cloud cover, but it remains unknown whether he ever found one, as he was never seen again. Some people will report hearing a plane flying over areas away from the route that he usually took, and when he failed to arrive for his delivery in Salt Lake City, a search was organized. Tips came flowing in fast, with some people reporting they'd seen emergency flares alight somewhere close to the Sawhill Canyon, and others state that they'd seen a plane disintegrating a short distance from the Bristol mines. For the next 6 days, a massive search operation failed to find any sign of Maurice or his plane. Temperatures along his route had plummeted dramatically, and if he made an emergency landing, there was very little chance that he could have now survived against the elements. No sign of him was ever found, and despite the best efforts of his fellow pilots and hundreds of searchers, no one ever learned what happened to Maurice that day. Number 7. The mystery surrounding the demise of 55-year-old Janet Rogers remains one of the oldest unsolved crimes in the history of the United Kingdom, and there's very little chance that we'll ever learn who ended her life. In March of 1866, Janet traveled from her home in Perth, Scotland, to Mount Stewart Farm, where her brother William lived. He'd contacted her, saying that his domestic servant had quit and that he needed help with the household chores. She agreed to help out and arrived at the farm, which was located a few miles south of Perth a few days later. William had inherited the farm from their father and never married or had any children, meaning that running the entire property was up to him. After arriving at the farm on the 28th of March, she took her time to get settled in and then started getting to work on the chores that needed to be done. William and his only plowman, James Crichton, were now free to tend to the cattle and fields, and on the 30th of March, William was heading out to a market in town. He and Janet had breakfast together that morning, and Crichton was given several duties to perform throughout the day. By this time, William and Crichton weren't on the best of terms, since William had accused him of stealing from him, but work was scarce and hence Crichton stayed on at the farm. At around 10:30 a.m., William set off for town on his horse, and Janet told him that she might visit a relative later on in the day, since she'd completed her chores. Crichton would state that he saw an unknown man with a dog about half an hour later, and another resident who'd seen the same man provided a description to the police. She stated that he was about 40 years old, unshaven, standing about 5 foot 8 inches tall, and that he was wearing a dark coat and cap. William, completely oblivious to all of this, arrived home at around 6:30 p.m., and to his surprise he couldn't get into the house as both doors were locked. Janet failed to answer when he knocked, and so he resorted to climbing through a window. When he walked into his kitchen, his heart dropped when he saw Janet lying on the floor, deceased. The police and a doctor were called, and it was determined that Janet had been attacked at around 3 p.m. that day, and that her attacker had ended her life with an axe. Her remains had been covered with a blanket, and the doors were locked from the inside. Investigators felt that this was an indication that the culprit either knew Janet or was remorseful over their actions. Several clues were recovered from the scene, including the axe used in the attack, a footprint that was left in the kitchen, 3 paper bags, one of which contained snuff, and strangest of all, a pipe that had been shoved under a pillow. It was believed that the pipe belonged to the attacker since neither William nor Janet smoked. The house was left in disarray as if someone was looking for something, and it was discovered that several items had been stolen. These included a $1 note, a pocketbook, a few eggs, and a pair of pants. After a $100 reward was announced for information, leading to the identification of the culprit, many leads started coming in, but none were of any use. Several people were questioned, only to be cleared of any suspicion. Some people provided spurious tips in hopes of getting reward money, which only hindered the investigation. Police noted that when they questioned William about who he thought the killer might be, he grew very irritated and red in the face. After 8 months with no progress in the case, William's former domestic servant told the police that Crichton had confessed to her that he'd committed the crime, but she wasn't taken seriously, since it was known that she lived with him for a while and had grown jealous of his wife. Others felt that she wanted her old job back and made her tale to curry favor with William, but to no avail. William accused Crichton, and he was regarded as the main suspect, but his guilt could not be proven due to a lack of evidence. Number 6. 55-year-old Peter Gibb is yet another pilot who was the subject of a very strange mystery that's left experts baffled since his passing in 1975. And while some aspects of the mystery have been solved, many questions remain unanswered. At the time, Peter had become a very successful businessman, but he had a noted past as a pilot. While serving in World War II, he flew a Spitfire and became known for keeping his cool under stressful situations. He exited the war as a decorated pilot, but once he returned home to London, England, he purchased a small 2-seater Cessna that he used to fly to Mull on occasion. He racked up hundreds of hours of flight time, and so when he decided to take off on Christmas Eve that year, there was no concern for his safety. He traveled to Mull once again and booked a room at the Glenforsa Hotel. With him was his girlfriend, Felicity Granger, with whom he had a Christmas meal that night, and once he was done with dinner, he suddenly decided to go on an impromptu flight. But there were a few issues that Peter should have taken into account that night. His pilot's license was no longer valid as he had neglected to renew it, and the weather was far from ideal as there was no moon, making it hard to see. And further, his plane was not of the type that would usually be chosen for a night flight. He usually wore prescription glasses while flying, but he didn't have these with him, and he'd been made aware of a storm that was rolling into the area. But he would not be dissuaded, and he borrowed 2 torches from the hotel, which he placed on the ground to act as landing lights. Felicity accompanied him to the airplane, but decided to remain on the ground, and she watched as Peter started the engine and disappeared into the night. She would have never known this was the last time that she'd see him alive. Felicity waited for some time, but Peter never returned, and eventually she started to worry that something had gone wrong, and she asked the staff at the hotel to contact the police. A search was immediately started, but for 4 months, no sign of Peter or his plane was found. But in April of that next year, a shepherd came across Peter's remains. He was found lying on top of a tree that had fallen over, and it seemed as though he'd sustained no serious injuries. The autopsy revealed that he had not suffered any life-threatening injuries, and that he'd likely not crashed his plane since there were no signs of impact to his body, and that he hadn't been at the ocean before his passing. It was determined he'd lost his life due to exposure to the elements. His plane could not be located, leaving investigators wondering whether he'd crashed, and if so, what had happened to his craft. Number 5. Inexplicable disappearances are some of the most perplexing mysteries that investigators have to deal with. And the case involving Jesus de Helindez, a Spanish lecturer at Columbia University in New York, is one such case that seems to have no solution. The mystery started on the 12th of March, 1956, when he finished giving a graduate seminar on Latin American government. He completed that seminar at around 9:30 p.m., and then got a ride from one of his students to 57th Street and 8th Avenue, where he was seen walking into the subway. Since he was single and was known to have no particular regular route, no one noticed that he'd gone missing until days later. And when he was reported as missing, the police traveled to his apartment. When it was searched, everything seemed to be in place, and there were no signs that anything untoward had taken place. Most people believe that he'd traveled back to the Dominican Republic, since it was known that he'd lived there for several years. But those close to him doubted this theory, since he told them that he was worried about being harmed by certain people from that country. This was due to the fact that after General Franco emerged victorious in the Spanish Civil War, Jesus relocated to Ciudad Trujillo, now known as Santo Domingo. And there, he made a name for himself while working with the government's national economy and labor departments. But he soon found himself in trouble over his democratic views, and in 1946, he thought it better to flee to New York, where he started his teaching career. He wrote a dissertation called The Era of Trujillo, in which he spoke of Trujillo's abuse of power and dictatorship, which would not have impressed the government back in the Dominican Republic. After becoming aware of the dissertation, a Dominican consular officer alerted Trujillo to its existence and contents. He was offered $25,000 to hand the dissertation over to Trujillo, but Jesus declined. It then came to light that Jesus was about to present the piece to the faculty committee at the university, and this irked Trujillo to the point that he decided to end Jesus's life. A night watchman at an airfield in Amityville would later state that he saw a deceased person being loaded onto a small plane on the 12th of March, 1956, but he passed away from a suspicious heart attack a few days later. A mechanic in West Palm Beach also witnessed the event, but he also lost his life under mysterious circumstances before he could testify to the fact. Number 4. In 1866, a strange case unfolded in Dos Palmas, which is located close to Palm Springs, California, and it remains unsolved today. It involves a man named Herman Ehrenberg, who was well known in the area at the time, making his case all the more baffling. On the 10th of October that year, Herman lost his life close to a relay station in the area. He was lying deceased across a wooden pallet, and when the police investigated, it was discovered that he was the victim of a homicide, since he'd been attacked with a firearm. Herman was an accomplished miner and surveyor who'd relocated to the US from then Prussia, which is now known as Russia, many years earlier. He'd fought in the Texas Revolution and miraculously made it out of the Goliad massacre alive. It's known that he traveled to San Bernardino from Yuma just before his life was ended, and that he'd been sleeping on the pallet where he was found, having arrived at the station on the 9th of October. A few people had learned he was planning on buying a mine in the area, and that he was carrying about $3,500 on his person, which would have likely made him a target for robbers, since this was a massive amount of money at the time. The next day, the station master, a man named W.H. Smith, reported that he was asleep that night, and that he woke with a start after someone discharged a firearm at around midnight. He went outside to investigate, and that's when he found Herman gravely injured. He called for aid, but by the time it arrived, it was too late. He also noted that some items had been stolen from a small storeroom close by, and it was suspected that it was the work of members of the Cahuilla tribe. Speculation had it that they were in the process of robbing the storeroom, and that Herman surprised them when he went to investigate. But there was no supporting evidence of this, and a few months later, another theory emerged. It was said that the true culprit was seen by members of the tribe, and that they tracked him to Agua Caliente, which is now Palm Springs, where they ended his life. This was not the last theory that would be suggested, though. One of Herman's friends, Charles Preston, accused Smith of the crime, but he only believed this due to the fact that Smith was present at the time, and because he would have had a lot of time to commit the act and steal Herman's cash. No one was ever named a suspect, and it would only be 8 decades later that another theory was put forward. Bill McCoy revealed that he had traveled to the area with Herman and 2 other men, and they decided to rest at Mule Springs, where something strange happened. One of the other 2 men expressed his interest in a woman living in the area, and upon hearing about this, a friend of hers challenged the man to a fight. After he lost the fight, her friend followed the group to San Bernardino, where he ended Herman's life, mistakenly believing he was the man he'd fought with. But again, no proof of this was ever found, and the true events of that night have never been determined. Number 3. Lewis Carroll, whose real name is Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, is best remembered as the author of 2 of the most famous books of all time, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which served as a sequel. But it's known that he kept several diaries over the years, and it's believed that he authored at least 13 volumes. But today, historians are desperate to find out what happened to 4 of those diaries that have inexplicably disappeared, and a few theories have been suggested. Carroll's nephew, who served as his biographer, stated that Carroll kept diaries from a young age, and it's believed that he wrote the first at age 10. The diaries that we know of today were written from 1855, just before he turned 23 years old, and they contain a mix of subjects. He wrote about famous people that he was lucky enough to meet, the classes that he attended while at Oxford University, experiments in photography that he conducted, and the lectures that he delivered after he retired. He kept these diaries in his possessions at all times, but when he passed away in January of 1898, they were inherited by his remaining family members, since he never had any children nor did he marry. It's been suggested that they didn't like everything they read in those diaries, since they felt that Carroll should be remembered as a virtuous and pious person who became an author so that he could bring joy to children. But the contents of the diaries may have shocked them, as they revealed his true nature. In reality, he was a very outgoing man who enjoyed spending time with women. They believed him to be reclusive, but upon reading his diaries, they learned that he was an amateur inventor who spent time with other famous actors such as Mark Twain, and who spent a lot of time outdoors since he loved going on long walks. They ordered his nephew to write a biography that painted him as a shy and inhibited man, and only certain sections of his diaries were included to create the illusion that he only cared about writing children's books. Then, in 1932, it came to light that 4 of the diaries had disappeared, and his family claimed that they'd been misplaced while they were moving into a new house. They decided to donate the rest of the diaries to the British Library in 1969, but staff at the library immediately noticed that 10 pages were missing. It's known that 2 of those pages were torn out by Carroll, but the other 8 were removed by his family for reasons unknown. One particular missing page contained the reason for Carroll and Alice Liddell's family, the girl who served as inspiration for his famous book, becoming enraged. It's been suggested that Carol proposed marriage to Alice and that the family was outraged when they found out about this, but this has never been proven. All that's known about this chapter in his life is that he started spending less time with the family and eventually kept his distance altogether. Number 2. Much has been said about the passing of Orville Gibson, a wealthy dairy farmer who lived in Newbury, Vermont, since he's said to have been disliked by most people in the area, and his case has never been solved. By the beginning of 1957, Gibson, who was known as Hoot, had gained a reputation as a rude and sometimes violent man, and in December of 1956, he was arrested after he was accused of assaulting Ari Martin, one of his hired hands, who was an elderly man. But before he could face the charges in court, he suddenly disappeared in the early morning hours of the 1st of January, 1956. His absence was no great loss to the surrounding community, but an investigation still had to be carried out, and for 3 months, 2 state troopers, William Graham and Lawrence Washburn, who were handed the case, were left baffled as they could find no sign of him or any clues to indicate what might have happened to him. It was known that he'd walked out to his barn that morning at around 4 a.m., and he was about to milk 2 of his cows, and to do so, he had to cross the state highway that lay between his farm and the barn. It's also certain that he didn't merely leave the area of his own free will, since he would never dream of leaving his farm unattended. In April of that year, some answers were finally found when Gibson's body was discovered in the Connecticut River. Gibson's wife, Evelyn, was questioned, and she recounted the events of that morning, stating that her husband left to milk his cows and never returned. When the barn was searched, they found scuff marks on the floor and evidence suggesting that something large, such as a body, was dragged into the yard outside the barn. It was suggested that he was beset upon by someone who assaulted him before tying him up and abducting him. The fact that Gibson had assaulted Martin, a much smaller and older man than he was, over some spilled milk had outraged the community, and it was suggested that his life was ended in a form of mob justice. Martin had suffered serious injuries as a result of the assault, and had only just survived while receiving treatment at a local hospital. Or so it was said by the locals. The truth was that he suffered a few minor bruises and was never taken to a hospital. With this type of misinformation being spread around town, the investigation was hindered, and Graham and Washburn's task was made more difficult. Later on, a unique mix of hay and cattle feed was found on a bridge at the river, and it was determined to belong to Gibson. For reasons unspecified, 2 men, Ozzie Welch and Frank Carpenter, were arrested by ending Gibson's life, but no evidence to prove their guilt was ever found, and they were eventually acquitted. It would later come to light that Martin had lied about the assault. He confessed that on the day in question, he arrived at work intoxicated and was ordered by Gibson to go home to sleep it off, but he refused and followed Gibson into the barn, cursing at him, which prompted the farmer to throw him out of the barn. He scuffed his knee, but told his wife that he'd been attacked by Gibson and that he suffered kidney damage, leading to outrage in the local community. In the weeks that followed, Gibson received several threats on his life via postcard, and at one point several cars were seen parked outside of his house. He disappeared 7 hours later, and his life was ended, leaving us with a mystery that'll likely never be solved. Number 1. When we think of outlaws in the Wild West, most of us picture rugged men on horseback who used to terrorize small towns during the later 1800s. But this was not always the case. One woman named Belle Starr made a name for herself as a feared outlaw who was seen in the company of Frank and Jesse James, 2 of the most notorious outlaws who ever lived in the West. Belle's full name was Myra Maybelle Starr, and she was born in Carthage, Missouri in 1848. She married twice in her life, first to Jim Reed and then to Sam Starr. But her last marriage ended in 1886, 3 years before she lost her life under strange circumstances that have never been explained. As an adult, she was often seen in the company of criminals, such as her first husband, who had to evade the law on several occasions. It's assumed that she helped him carry out several crimes before he lost his life in 1874, but this has never been proven. In fact, it's been suggested that she wanted a normal, quiet life since she moved back to her family's farm and divorced Reed shortly before his demise. She married Starr, the leader of a gang, in 1880. And since he was part Cherokee, they lived on tribal land, where they often hid famous outlaws like the James brothers from the law. The couple spent some time in prison after they were caught stealing horses, and Belle gained a reputation as an outlaw. She was known to carry 2 firearms at all times, but some people believe this to be an embellishment. After her second husband lost his life, she remained on tribal land and is said to have turned over a new leaf, as she no longer harbored outlaws and refused to defend their crimes. Then, on the 3rd of February, 1889, Belle was found deceased in Briartown, Oklahoma. It was revealed that she was on a trip to Fort Smith and that she changed her plans at the last minute for unknown reasons. During the investigation, it was found she had many enemies, including her 2 children, Eddie and Pearl. A man named Edgar Watson was named as a prime suspect since he'd hired a strip of land from Belle, and when she found out that he was a wanted outlaw who'd ended someone's life, he was evicted, leaving him destitute. But there was no way of proving that he had ended her life since there were no witnesses and no clues as to the identity of Belle's attacker, and he was acquitted. Following this, nothing further could be done, and the case was never solved, making it one of the oldest unsolved crimes in Oklahoma's history. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.